Over a course of 3 centuries, there had been many types of steam locomotives preserved, built, and especially used on special excursion runs. Dozens of private groups restore these engines to operating condition as a respect for the past and an eye to educate future generations. Unfortunately, not every steam locomotive are around today. Some were retired for various reasons, or in the worst case, outright scrapped. Luckily, most of these engines here in this list won't be down for long, as there's a possibility they'll be turned back into glory very soon. With all that out of the way, let's count down the top 15 retired Steam Excursion Stars. Finally, a video that's not about gacha and not about cars. About time. Number 15. Grand Trunk Western number 5629. The 5629 has been countlessly explained by many other people. But I decided to put this low here because, well, obviously it's the most talked about engine because of how tragic its story was. Anyways, this locomotive is built in 1924 by the American Locomotive Company for the Grand Trunk Western, as it was designed to pull freight trains and possibly passenger trains on the Grand Trunk Western trackage. It was eventually retired in the early 1950s, but Richard Jensen was able to save it from scrap and decided to use it for special excursion runs. It even ran for the Schlitz and Circus train for 2 years in the 1960s. Sadly, in the early 1970s, Richard Jensen had financial troubles due to him having to pay his medical bills because he got his back broken due to a fridge accident. So as a result, he ended up signing a deal with the Blue Island Railroad so that way the locomotive can be stored there. However, during the 5629's time in the Blue Island complex, the complex was immediately abandoned after Metra acquired the yard. However, even though Metra was allowed to move other rolling stock that was left abandoned there, they're not legally allowed to move the 5629. After several groups, including the Illinois Railway Museum, Metra had had enough. They sent out a salvage crew and cut 5629 up right where she stood. All rail fans can do was watch in horror and disbelief as the once preserved engine is finally being scrapped. Today, the 5629 story still stands as a result of sadness and abandonment. Thankfully, there are other engines that are still around today, including Grand Trunk Western K5A number 5632, which ironically is another locomotive which, spoiler alert, it's not on this list. Number 14. Union Pacific Heavy Challenger number 3967. Another unfortunate extinct excursion star, this engine actually places a lot higher than the 5629. I'll explain in a bit. The 3967 was among 105 Union Pacific Challengers ever built by ALCO for the Union Pacific Railroad. However, the 3967 is among the only Union Pacific Challenger to stand out in the days of steam, as it ended up pulling the first ever Union Pacific steam excursion in 1953, sponsored by, you guessed it, the Rocky Mountain Railroad Club. During the excursion, the 3967 was given special smoke deflectors as it stood out on the trip. After the excursion run over Sherman Hill, the locomotive was put back into freight service. Dang, I really wish the Challengers were more like the world's largest mixed traffic engines. Sadly, the 3967 was among 103 Union Pacific Challengers to be sent off to the scrap yard in around the early 1960s and the late 50s. However, the 3967's ghost will finally return 40 and 50 years to the day. On May 17th, 1993 and in 2003, Union Pacific Challenger number 3985 masqueraded and disguised as none other than the 3967 to do the same run as its fallen sibling. Today, 2 Union Pacific Challengers are still preserved and luckily carry on the legacy of the late 3967. Honestly, it's a real shame that the 3967 wasn't saved, because it's the only Union Pacific Challenger that didn't stand out in the days of Steam. Just like 4005, which also is the only big boy that stood out in the days of Steam. Today, 2 Union Pacific Challengers are still around preserved. Those engines being 3977 in the Greyhound paint scheme, and 3985, which is currently undergoing a restoration. Who knows, maybe it'll run again soon. Fingers crossed. Number 13. Southern Pacific GS4 number 4449. While not officially confirmed, I have to put it in this list because the locomotive hasn't ran in almost a year, or 2 years actually. So I think it's best if I talk about this engine. The 4449 was among 28 GS4 Northerns built by Lima Locomotive Works in 1939, and it was primarily used for the daylight passenger trains of the Southern Pacific Railroad. However, after retirement in 1958, the locomotive ended up being put into storage, and then eventually donated to the Oregon Railroad Museum, where it's been on display until 1974, when Ross Rowland decided to purchase it and use it for the famed American Freedom Train. After 2 years of work, the locomotive was finally brought back into action with a brand new paint job consisting of the iconic red, white, and blue colors. And it looks really beautiful. After the celebrations were over, the locomotive was repainted back into its original daylight paint scheme in 1977 and started operating on normal excursion runs all throughout the United States. And it even at one point in 1989 raced alongside Union Pacific FEF3 number 844, which is famously the only steam locomotive to never be put into retirement. The 4449 will continue to run excursions for another few years, specifically 45 years, but unfortunately the locomotive ended up having to be put on display back in Portland, Oregon, where it's sat ever since. Whether or not the locomotive actually is retired or not, but despite its roller coaster career, this beautiful streamlined Northern has made many great memories for all who have seen her. Who knows, maybe it's just temporary, but at the time of this recording, the 4449 is still in Portland, Oregon on display. Who knows, maybe it'll be back in action in a minute. Fingers crossed. Last time I say fingers crossed, I promise.